Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this AHDB webinar. I am Andrew Palmer, Knowledge Exchange Manager for the Eastern region, and will be today's webinar host. Behind the scenes, we have Aisha Shabman from AHDB Marcom's team, and will be helping with the technical side of the webinar. You'll be joining this webinar on mute, so we won't hear you. There will be a formal question period, so feel free to ask questions during the webinar. These will be answered at the end of our session. You can do this by opening the questions panel, which will be shown on the right-hand side of your screen. You can also use this to raise any technical issues you are experiencing during this webinar. The webinar will be recorded and published on YouTube and the AHDB website should you want to revisit any of the content. You will also be prompted to enter a survey. The survey at the end of the webinar, please take time to complete this so we can improve the webinars we run in the future. Today's presenter is Claire Barber, who is a health and welfare scientist within the health and welfare team at AHDB. We are going to cover the new welfare codes that came into effect on the March the 1st this year. We had already started to cover this subject within our Pig Club and discussion group programs, but due to COVID-19, we had to cancel several meetings in line with government guidelines and could not fully finish the seasons of meetings. The webinar is an opportunity to understand the changes to the codes that could impact your business and suggest new ways of recording and working in certain key areas that will help your business adopt the new codes. We have an hour of time booked into this webinar, and I will endeavour to keep the time. If we don't get around to answering all the questions, we will reply directly to you after the webinar has finished. I will now hand over to Claire.
Hello, thank you for that introduction. Hopefully you can see the slides now or in a moment. There. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. We're just going to take you through a few things that we hope to cover in this webinar. Sorry about the pause back there. We just want to give you an overview of these new DEFRA codes of practice for the welfare of pigs and give you a little bit of information about the code. Obviously that they cover quite a few proposed changes, so we want to highlight the main ones of those. As we go through the webinar, you'll see that there are some uncertainties about how these codes might be interpreted in practice on farm. And we won't have the answers today about those, but what we will do is highlight what those uncertainties are, just in case they're not already obvious to you, which I'm sure for some of you they certainly are. And then the last part of the webinar, we're going to very briefly give you an overview of a few of the AHDB tools that we hope might be able to help you comply with some aspects of these codes. So that's largely our tail biting web hat, which is a risk assessment tool, and also our environmental enrichment guide, which is available to download. And we'll also cover how you might be able to use your real welfare producer reports if you are red tractor assured and have those carried out for you by your vet, how those might provide evidence to help you with showing compliance with the code. So what do you need to know about the codes? Well, first of all, this is what they look like, a nice different colour cover from the 2003 version. Now, one of the main things about the code is that these are not actually available as a hard copy from DEFRA. So what you do is you need to download them, and the place to download them is up at the top there, which is not a very memorable sort of like website link. Now we're going to be able to provide that link for the codes for you later on, or I understand that there is a handout option on the webinar that you can also get the link from, so don't worry about copying that down. So what is the code? Well, the code is basically DEFRA's interpretation of the existing welfare legislation. Now, throughout the code, that pieces of legislation are highlighted in boxes to make them quite distinct for you from the best guidance and practice parts of the code. Another distinction to make is the wording that is used throughout the code. If something says that you must do something, that is in reference to the legislation. And if it says that you should do something, then that's in reference to the bits that are the best practice and guidance. So how is the code to be used? Well, it's essentially to be used by bodies like APHA to see whether welfare standards are being met. Now, parts of the code aren't legislation. However, if you were to be prosecuted for welfare issues, and it was also found that you were not complying with the best practice parts of the code, that could be used in evidence against you. So it's, as a worst case scenario, that's just to cover how these get used. Now, all producers and keepers of pigs, whether you have one pet pig or a big commercial unit, all producers and your employees are expected to familiarise yourselves with the code. Now, DEFRA estimate that this will take about 3 hours to read through and be aware of that. So that's quite a chunk, and it's worth remembering here that the earlier codes in 2003 were only about 35 pages long. This is quite a much bigger code, around about 68 pages. So there's a lot more information in this version. Now, the codes only apply to England, but we are expecting that the devolved administrations will aim to align their new codes with this one that we're covering today. And as Andrew mentioned in his introduction, these codes came into force on the 1st of March this year. So I'm just going to highlight quickly for you the main changes to the 2003 version, apart from them suddenly being a lot bigger and more pages to read. Essentially, there is a lot more best practice included within this code. This includes improved practices on how you may be able to try to prevent tail biting on your units, and it also focuses quite a lot on avoiding to need tail docking. There's quite a lot of guidance in the codes on enrichment and the attributes that are expected of enrichments that you provide for your pigs. Now, I've marked in red this part of change because I think this is one of the main key changes throughout the code, is that there is a much greater emphasis on record keeping, and that especially relates to matters of tail biting instances, the kind of measures and actions that you're taking to try to prevent that. It also has a lot of emphasis on recording light levels and your medicine use. Other areas of greater focus that are highlighted within this code are the correct handling of pigs and putting a lot more emphasis on correct stockmanship and good stockmanship. And for the first time, we have a statement within this code that DEFRA has an intention to move towards a future where farrowing crates are no longer needed. And there is some advice within the code on alternative systems for farrowing. We're going to take each of those and just give you a little bit more detail. So we'll start with tail docking, and the legislation states that routine tail docking is not permitted and it should only be used as a last resort after improvements to the pig's environment and the things that you're doing to prevent tail biting have proved not to work and you need to tail dock. So there's a lot of emphasis in this code that producers must start to try and record instances of tail biting and outbreaks that occur on their units. And you've also got to record actions that you're taking to try and prevent any tail biting in the first place. And this is to try and justify why you may need to tail dock. Now, if there is no recording and no supporting evidence of tail biting, and you are still docking the tails of your pigs, it is possible that legality of your tail docking procedure could be called into question, and producers could be penalised either through the single payment deductions or worst case scenario is that you could actually, because of a breach of the code, be taken to court for this. So that shows you the importance that's being placed on recording these tail biting and your actions to prevent it. Now, if there's a breeding unit where tail docking is carried out at the request of your suppliers, the people you're supplying pigs to, sorry, then it becomes the responsibility of the owner of the breeding unit to actually request evidence of those units they're supplying to justify why they need to tail dock. Now, we don't actually know what evidence is actually required at the moment. That hasn't been clarified for us. It may be that that's in the form of a vet derogation letter, but it's just to highlight that's one of the uncertainties. Now, if tail docking is used on a farm to prevent tail biting, and that is used for a sustained period, once again, that's not clarified in the code what is meant by a sustained period, then it is said that a more regular review of the actions you're taking to minimise tail biting will need to be reviewed and clarified. And it may be that you would be asked to change what you're doing to try to prevent tail biting if you're needing to continue docking for a sustained period of time. Now, we're going to cover a bit later in the webinar our tail biting web app, which might be able to help you with some of these requirements to record tail docking and assess your risk of tail biting. Now, the new welfare codes also cover enrichment in a much more expanded way to those of 2003. The legislation states that all pigs must have permanent access to enrichment materials to enable them to be able to carry out proper investigation and manipulation and foraging activities. At the same time, those enrichments should not compromise their health, so they should be safe and hygienic. And also, ideally, the code states that they should have these 4 characteristics: that they should be edible, so a pig can eat and smell them; they should be chewable, so that a pig can bite into them; they should be investigatable, so that a pig can thoroughly forage and work them out; and they should be manipulable, so that a pig is able to change their location within the pen, possibly their appearance or their structure. Now, it's not necessary that an enrichment has to have all of these 4 attributes, but if it does, it's considered in the code to be optimal. And an example of an optimal enrichment which has all 4 of these would be something like straw or root vegetables. Now, the code also goes on to say that if only some of these attributes are met, then the enrichment is considered to be suboptimal. And if only 1 or 2 are met by the enrichment type, they're considered to be marginal, and they need to be supplemented with other types of enrichment that try to cover the other missing attributes. So the code gives quite a bit of guidance there in the form of a table of some of the commonly used enrichment materials in pig units, and it gives suggestions on how you may use them and when and for what kind of pigs and in what housing types. It also states in the code that if you're planning to have any new accommodation for your pigs or any new slurry management systems, then you need to show that you have considered in the future the build of those accommodation, that you've considered whether they can take adequate enrichment materials to be provided for your pigs. So, for example, considering the type of flooring that you're going to put in. This doesn't mean to say that you're not able to put in a slurry system that can't take straw, for example. It's just to show that if you were asked, that you've had a thought about that and you're able to justify why you haven't put that type of system or accommodation in and why you're not able to use that type of enrichment. Now, to expand this a little bit more, AHDB have drawn together an environmental enrichment guide, which we'll cover a little bit later, which goes through a similar type of thing to the table in the code. Now, I emphasised a little bit earlier that one of the main changes in the code is this requirement that's been very much beefed up and made a lot stronger on the need for recording and planning And there's some particular requirements that we're going to highlight, including one which is a new requirement that people should be checking their light levels that are in all of the pens that you provide throughout all stages of rearing, and that includes farrowing accommodation. So for the first time, you're going to be required to monitor your light levels and keep a record of them. This is because there is a piece of legislation that states that if pigs are kept in artificially lit buildings with no access to natural light, then they mustn't be kept below a minimum of 40 lux. So that's a new requirement. We need to highlight that to you, that you need to start being prepared to be able to do that. The rest of the recording and planning really focuses quite a lot on the development of a health and welfare plan. And this, for most people, hopefully will not be too onerous, because if you are Red Tractor approved, this is something that you should already have in place. But for those people that aren't Red Tractor approved, all owners and keepers will be required to draw up a written health plan with their veterinary surgeon, and if necessary, anybody else that advises you on your pig keeping. And this plan needs to be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. And it should cover things like the husbandry activities that you take part in, and all measures that you use to prevent, treat and limit disease and welfare problems. Now that will include things like vaccinations, any health procedures, any medication treatments, and it will also need to include the things that you're doing to minimise the risk of tail biting. Now, also a Red Tractor requirement at the moment, and but for other people that aren't Red Tractor approved, that plan will also need to cover contingency planning, where you set out what you plan to do if emergencies strike, such as flooding, fire, extremes of temperature, or anything that could restrict your pigs moving off of the unit. It will also need to cover what you would put in place should you have disruption of supplies regarding feed, water and electricity. Now, stockmanship is one of the things that has the biggest impact on animal welfare, and this is quite well documented. Now, there's a lot of emphasis that's been put on the code onto the good handling and stockmanship of pigs. And this has come about because of a number of animal rights exposés that have taken place over the last few years. Now, the code sets out what is expected of pig keepers when they're handling their animals, and I would hope that for a lot of us, this is things that we already do and are aware of, and fairly common sense. But it puts in the code for the first time in black and white a number of attributes that pig owners and keepers should be able to demonstrate. So, for example, having caring and responsible planning and management skills, having knowledgeable stockmanship, so that covers training. It also requests that people have considerate loading and unloading, because the code not only covers pigs on farm or where they're kept, but also transportation as well. And there's also the requirement that somebody on a unit, or the person responsible for the pigs, is able to undertake correct procedures regarding the humane killing of pigs and euthanasia, should that be required. The code also explicitly says that care needs to be given to pigs when being moved, and that it's not acceptable to strike or kick pigs. Now, we all know that pigs at times can be difficult to move and to handle, and this is really just trying to encourage people to think that if a pig or group of pigs are being difficult to move, why that might be. Is it that the place that you're trying to move them to is particularly dark or frightening, or there's corners? And it's just trying to encourage people to think about how they might be able to change what they do to move those pigs in as quiet and carefully way as possible. Now, one of the last pieces of the main changes is that covers farrowing. Now, this is a very new piece for the code, and it was a little bit unexpected because for the first time, DEFRA have included, outside of consultation, this aim that there is for farrowing crates to no longer be necessary, and for any new systems that are put in place or new accommodation to protect the welfare of the sow as well as that of her piglets. Now, this doesn't mean to say that there is a ban on farrowing crates necessarily coming. There is no lead times for phasing out of farrowing crates stated, but it does show that there is a trajectory of travel that DEFRA would like to see these farrowing crates being reduced in use, or if they are used, that there is a minimum times possible used for the amount of time a sow spends in them. But this section also covers the need for providing nesting material. Now, at the moment, if you have flooring types and slurry systems that can't take certain types of nesting material, you're not necessarily needed to provide them. But this is strongly encouraging people to think of providing nesting material in a number of forms. So that doesn't mean it has to be straw. It could be shavings or shredded paper. And this links back to that other bit of the code that covers enrichment types, where some nesting material is also covered in there of what could be used and how it could be presented. But leading on from that, not only is it encouraging people to use nesting material wherever possible, the code highlights the requirement for people to provide their pigs with permanent enrichment in farrowing crates if they're used. And that is in addition to nesting material. So that is quite explicitly saying that, and it's for sows as well as piglets. Okay, so we'd just like to cover, as I've been talking through this, you'll probably have realised that there's quite a few uncertainties regarding how some of these things may be interpreted in a practical way on farm during things like an APHA inspection. Now, the codes came in force on the 1st of March, and then obviously in a very short period of time, we had shutdown and lockdowns relating to COVID-19. So that has changed. It was hoped that we would be having some meetings between DEFRA, APHA, the National Pig Association, and also Pig Veterinary Society. Now, I do believe that a meeting took place in March, but because of the delay resulting from the changes and regulations of COVID-19, we haven't had distributed to us or any sign off of what was discussed. So unfortunately, we don't have any interpretations of how some of these changes may be put into practice on farm, particularly relating to things like the changes on tail docking and tail biting, what is acceptable forms of enrichment, or how light is going to be measured in a practical way in a pig building or a pen. So because of this, there is a transition period until July that has been agreed with DEFRA about the compliance with this new code. Now, that doesn't mean to say that people don't have to bother trying to put it in place or complying with the code right now. It just means there's a little bit of leeway. But obviously, if there was a severe problem with welfare on a unit and you weren't complying with the legislation, that could still result in penalties for you. So it's just to highlight that we are still awaiting some interpretations to be released and signed off, and we're not able to kind of give you too much information on what those might be. I don't want to give out false information for it to change later. So obviously we're going to have to try and find ways to update you later on. Okay, so I'm just going to move over to the next part, which is how AHDB have got some tools that may be able to help you with the compliance of some of these new parts of the code. And we're going to go back to tail docking and tail biting again. So just to reiterate the legislation that states that the procedure of tail docking may only be carried out where measures to improve environmental conditions have first been taken to prevent tail biting, but you're still having evidence to show injury to pigs' tails. You still have tail biting occurring. So in order to try and help you comply with that legislation and the best practice, AHDB a little while ago carried out some funding research that identified and ranked statistically 83 of the most important risks for tail biting. And what we did with this research was that we used it to develop what we call a web hat, which is it stands for a web-based husbandry advisory tool, which is really just a posh way of saying a risk assessment online. So we call it the web hat, and I'm going to refer it to that from now on. And it is a risk assessment, but it also gives you some information on how to identify those risks. It also covers what may be early warning signs for you to look out for on your units before any outbreak actually occurs. So you're trying to highlight and prevent tail biting rather than just dealing with it when it occurs. It also gives you some examples of recording sheets that you could use to record tail biting incidents. So that relates back to that requirement in the code to be recording tail biting and to, you know, be able to justify you have it on your unit if you want to tail dock or feel the need to tail dock your pigs. There's also the main bulk of this tool is building a prioritized risk assessment report that is tailored to that unit, and it will rank your risks from the highest risks down to the lowest. And then it goes on to give you some practical suggestions on how you might be able to act on those risks and minimize them. So that's what the web hat does, and it's probably just as important here to make a note of what the web hat doesn't do. The web hat is not something that if you slavishly followed all of the suggestions within it of what you could do, that you're going to prevent tail biting and not have instances. I'm afraid it's not that. It is just something that is working for you to work with your vet and other advisors to try and reduce and minimize your risk. It's not actually going to solve your problem for you, I'm afraid. So how do you access this tool? Well, it's largely through the AHDB pork website, and the red circles will highlight where you can find that. Now, if you're signed up as well to Pork Weekly, that comes through every Friday as an email, at the bottom of Pork Weekly, there is a link to our pork toolbox, and the web hat link is included in that too. So we'll just cover a little bit more to show you a little bit about the web hat. And it's important to note here that as well as it being a tool online, the web hat also covers a process, which is 4 stages of recording, assessing, acting, and reviewing. And this is a continuous cycle for trying to minimize tail biting risk. Now, part of the recording stage is that there is some information within your web hat about trying to identify early signs of tail biting. And now there is a downloadable poster that could be printed out or kept on a computer or device. But you could also get a copy of this from our comms team, and I think there'll be some emails sent out a bit later, but it's in the web hat how to get there. Now, we talked about the need for recording tail biting, and part of the process of the web hat is really to encourage people to do that, and now it's become a requirement within the code, so this is quite important. And we've got about 3 different versions of these data sheets that you might be able to use to help you get going on recording tail biting instances, in the fact that they give you the kind of columns and the kind of information that you may need to start recording to comply with that requirement in the code. You don't have to just use these. We've got a number of producers that we've worked with that have taken copies of these data sheets, and then they've tweaked them for their own use and to fit the requirements of their staff. So that's ideal, and that's what we hope people would do. But if you did just want something off the peg and to use, you could use this here or one of these. This is the basic version, and there are a few others that cover different systems, like for if you've got continuous flow of pigs or batch systems. So they are really just guidelines for how you might go about recording and completing that part of the process. Now, the main bulk of the tool is the assessment, and this is about building a risk report. Now, I mentioned about there being 83 different associated risks that are included within the web pack, and they're all presented in a similar fashion to this, where you are given a section where it tells you what to look for, so you can work out whether you're seeing or whether this is a risk that is appropriate or happening on your unit. And if it is, you can then click on the button over on the right and mark it up, and it will be added to your risk report that you will begin to build. Now, at the bottom, there is that grey bar that says more information, and if you were to click on that in the web pack, it would take you through to some suggestions for possible actions that you might be able to take to try to minimise each of these risks. So once you've selected all of the risks or the few risks, hopefully, that you have on your unit that are appropriate to you, the tool will then gather those into a risk report for you, and it will statistically rank them and colour code them for you, showing which are the highest risks for you, those that are most associated with tail biting, down to those that are the least associated. Now, it will also pull out all of that information about what you may be able to do about those risks and suggestions. And the idea is that not that you have to necessarily work on your highest risk, but at least that it makes you aware that that would be the highest risk for you. But it enables you to then use it as a tool to work through which of the risks you want to work on first or feel most important for you that you could do quickly or most cost effectively, and you would know what level of risk you're trying to minimize first. The other thing that the tail biting web pack does is that you could then go on to pull those risks into an action plan. And this is an example of an action plan that you can get through the web pack, where all of the risks that you selected will be popped into a spreadsheet for you. And then you can download this and add to it on your PC or manually and fill it out with some more information which APHA have highlighted to us they would hope to see. That's not to say this is AHPA approved, but we've certainly talked through it with them. And they would like to see in an action plan things like who is responsible for carrying out actions to minimise these risks, what those actions are, the date those are to be completed, and also for you to start doing the review part of this process and working out how successful some of those actions may be, and if they're not successful, what you're going to do instead. So that just covers what the web pack can help you with in relation to the codes. So we're going to move on to environmental enrichment, and as you'll be aware from the earlier part, this is something that pigs need to be given permanent access to, of enrichment in sufficient quantities. Now, it's still not any clearer throughout this code of what constitute a sufficient quantity. So those are things that need to have some form of clarification, hopefully. But to try and address this and comply with the legislation, AHDB have tried to pull into place a number of sources of information into one guide. Now, this gives advice to producers on providing different types of enrichments, and it sets them out by house and the age of the pig. So you don't have to read the whole thing. If you've got weaner pigs on slats indoors, then that's where you would go to that section, or finishers, you would go to there, because some of the enrichments that are suggested or how you present them would be slightly different throughout this guide. And we bring together information from farmers, researchers, and from scientific literature, but we also include information from a document known as the EU Commission Staff Working Document. This was advice issued by the EU, and it's not legislation, but it's sometimes taken almost as if it is. So we try to include that information in there too, to cover as broad a scope of how you could use different types of enrichment. And it's that document that gives us the attributes of different types of enrichment, like whether they're chewable, investigable, or manipulable. That's where we get that from, and we've put that into the code. So it's probably a bit easier to show you some examples of what's in there. And this is an example of root vegetables. Now, it states there that this is an optimal type of enrichment because it covers all of those 4 attributes that are deemed to be ideal for pigs. And in the guide, it gives you some info on how you may present that type of enrichment, but also some practical considerations. So obviously this is seasonal type of enrichment, and you've got to be careful if you're providing it that you also balance that with the overall rations for pigs nutritionally. And we've also got to be aware of other legislation that states that we do not provide kitchen waste to pigs as well. So a further example is of an enrichment that is considered to be suboptimal, and that's because it only contains or has some of those attributes in the fact that it's chewable, manipulable, but is of limited edible or investigable quality. And finally, this is an example of a marginal type of enrichment where it may only have 1 or 2 at the most of those qualities. And it's highlighted here that if you're using this enrichment, that's fine, but what you will need to do is complement it with other types of enrichment that are suboptimal or optimal that provide the other attributes that aren't covered. That would be in the ideal situation. So how to access the enrichment guide? This just covers that it's through the pork website, and the red circles show you where the tabs for going to there, and you can download it. We do also have, I think, some hard copies available, so you could also email our comms team and request a copy that way. Now, finally, I just would like to go over how some of you that have real welfare outcome assessments, how you may be able to use the reports from that to provide evidence of the things that you're doing on your unit to comply with the new codes, particularly in relation to tail damage and environmental enrichment. So just to highlight real welfare outcomes and the aims of the scheme, we've had this running since 2013, and it's hoped that there will be a record of indicators of pig welfare and monitor some changes for people on farm of the welfare standards. And it's also to try and identify areas of welfare improvements, and that's largely through your vet who carries out these assessments for you, highlighting areas that could be improved or things that might be able to be done. And that would be stuff that you would also include in your veterinary health plan. So given the requirements for proving that you're using environmental enrichment, it is necessary, if you have these assessments, and anybody who is Red Tractor approved would have those carried out by your vet. Your vet will have to record for you on these reports the type of environmental enrichment that you're using for your pigs, but it is not mandatory, it's optional for them to go on to say how they're being used. Now, it could be possible that you could ask your vet to actually start recording and doing that part of the assessment. So that there are some difficulties for some vets to carry that out, and that is a discussion that you might want to have with them, but essentially you may have to ask your vet to do it for you. But tail damage, at least if those severe tail damage, is recorded within real welfare, and that could be used as evidence of any issues that the unit has and be used as justification for tail docking. How do you access your real welfare outcomes reports? You don't need any new logins. You can do this through your Pig Hub logins, where you go to do your pig movements. So if you logged in to Pig Hub as usual, there would be a section there that says AHDB pork services, and we've ringed in red Under that, there would be a section and a link for real welfare producer reports, and that's the link that you would follow, and it would take you through to a screen that will hopefully bring up the details and results for your units, and you can access the actual report either through that arrow button on the right or the button that says download results, which gives you all of the reports. Now, this is just an example of a report summary that occurs at the top of a producer report. There are other coloured bars below, but we're not going to cover those today. Now, each of those measures that are recorded by your vet would be summarised in this table. Now, please don't worry about what the scores are, because this isn't a true real welfare assessment. It's just been mocked up for this, so it doesn't look particularly good. But it's just to highlight the information that you could then use as evidence, particularly relating to severe tail lesions, which all vets must carry out this measure, and you'd be able to use that as evidence if you have tail biting on your unit and when you might have had it. And if you did ask your vet, or they were already carrying out the enrichment usage measure for you, the results of that would appear here at the bottom too as a ratio. 0 means none of the pigs are using the enrichment that you're providing, and 1 means that all of the pigs are using it, which is probably unlikely, but you can actually use that to show that the enrichments you're using are actually having some use for the pigs. Now, a few other tools or pieces of information that we have. There's some guides on the AHDB pork website which cover ventilating buildings. There's also one on lighting, which will hopefully cover that, how to measure light within a pig building, helping you with that new requirement to be able to start monitoring light. And I think it's also quite important to highlight that there's a link there also for the Pig Veterinary Society's The Casualty Pig, which gives guidance on the correct and humane euthanasia of pigs, which is something that is quite key within the codes and the training of staff for that. Okay, so thank you very much for listening, and this is just a few ways that you can get in touch with either me or Andrew for further information if you wish it, and I think we've now got some time for questions.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much for covering that subject. Yes, we've had a few questions come through already. One was relating to the link on the other side of the screen there, but I think we may be sorting that out behind the screens. But as we said, we'll send out a link to all the publications later on after this webinar. Two questions, mainly revolving around light. The first one is, how often should light readings be taken?
This is one of the areas of uncertainty that hasn't yet been clarified. We're hoping that a further meeting between DEFRA, APHA, the PVS and NPA will clarify that point for us. You know, whether it's required on a weekly, monthly, daily basis, it just doesn't state that within the code at the moment. So I wouldn't like to try to say too much, because it's an interpretation that we're and a point that we're trying to get clarified. So I think it's going to have to be fairly pragmatic. So I would hope that it's not on because it just says regular. I hope it won't be on a daily basis, but it should be that it's, you know, a regular basis, and you can show that you have maintained your light and you're not leaving it, you know, down to once a year type thing or once a batch.
Another question relating to light. It's a little bit technical, referring to paragraphs within the code, but I'll read it word for word. Please, could you clarify whether the recording of light levels is also necessary for naturally lit buildings? It is 0.99 in the code, but not clear if this refers back to paragraph 7, that is artificial only, or is this a standalone statement?
It is my understanding, but we can seek further clarification, that this relates the 40 lux and requirement to, you will need to know about your light levels regardless for any internal building, but the 40 lux and the measurement actually only refer in the legislation to buildings that are artificially lit. So I think that we're seeking clarification. It may be that people still have to have some way of recording their lighting, but it may not necessarily be enforced in terms of how it relates to 40 lux.
Thank you. A couple more. There was a reference to new accommodation and plan and allowances for new accommodation and the use of enrichment. So for someone building a new, for argument's sake, a new slatted indoor building, what measures could they take to say that, you know, they've taken everything in place and they are doing what they can regards to enrichment and in the use of enrichment, additional enrichment?
Yeah, once again, this is another area that needs some clarification with DEFRA. We understand that they're not trying to stop people from building units with slurry systems that can't take enrichment, but you would need to show that you had considered being able to do so and be able to tell an inspector the reasons why you were not able to provide that type of enrichment and why you chose to build a building that wasn't able to, you know, had a flooring system that wasn't able to take it. But once again, we're seeking further clarification on how that's actually going to be practically assessed on farm.
Thank you. Another one. You mentioned the increasing use of using your vet on welfare score and assessments of pens of pigs and buildings. Is there any way we can help regards to the measurement and the degree of different measurement of enrichment products within a pen?
So I'm not sure I quite follow the question.
Is there a way we can scale different levels of enrichment in a pen, you know, to come up with an artificial score regards to how a particular combination of enrichment within a pen is better than another?
We don't have that at present. I mean, the ratio that's used within real welfare takes on board the number of pigs that are active that are also then playing with the enrichments, and it gives you this ratio for use. It doesn't relate to a particular type of enrichment, so that you would be saying it's enrichments in general. So if you're only providing one enrichment, it's able to relate that score back to just that. But if you've got two types of enrichment in the pen, it wouldn't make that distinction between which one was being played with and which wasn't.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm not aware that we particularly have a score for trying to say this enrichment gets played with more than this.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. We're struggling to find any more questions. Can you just run through the clarification on the optimal, the suboptimal, and the marginal again on the enrichment again, please? Just in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I mean, if an enrichment type is deemed, and this is not by AHDB, it's within that EU staff working document, if it's considered to be optimal, it has all four of those characteristics that I mentioned: the fact that it's chewable, manipulable, investigatable, and I've forgotten the last one. But yes, so it has all four of those. You're able to move it around and that. So that's an optimal type, and we're quite limited in the types of enrichment that have all four of those types. So straw would be one example. You would also have root vegetables. Now, if an enrichment type has most of those attributes but not all, it's considered to be suboptimal. And if it only has one or two, it's considered to be marginal.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned early on in the presentation on the web app, the procedure of the record, access, act and review. How often should that be done within a unit or a batch's lifetime?
We haven't put any stipulation on how frequently. I think that is something that needs to be discussed between, you know, for a unit that they work out themselves. We haven't put in that it's got to be done every year or anything like that. We haven't even stipulated that it has to be for every batch of pigs. But if there are some changes made on a unit, then I would suggest that the web hat is rerun to reassess those risks if there's some significant changes made. But I think that as people start to use it, and it can be run much more frequently, and it's really as people feel is helpful. So if people feel that they have made some changes and they want to reassess their risk, or they think that something that was previously flagged up as a risk is no longer one, they could then rerun the risk assessment and take that one out. And that would be up to the unit. But no, we don't currently have any guidance on how frequently to run the web app.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's come through, could we put root vegetables through a wet feeding system? Now, I understand practically from my own experience, it may be a little bit difficult because of the size of the ingredient you're using. You'd have to mash it down to a fairly small consistency, but I'd maybe suggest, you know, talking to your nutritionist, or maybe as you could use a root vegetable maybe as if you've seen the early warning signs within a particular pen, as an additional addition into the pen, as a distraction, as a tool or a toy for the animals to play with, sort of thing. So I think, yes, that might be a way to do it, maybe.
Yeah, we're not necessarily advocating root vegetables as just as a nutritional thing. It is more as something that they can, like in a whole form, so that they can move it, chew it, and manipulate it more, and use it like they would a toy, but a toy that they can eat.
Some more questions coming through now. There's been some background noise about the need to use two types of straw together and the use of toys in the addition to straw bedding as a way of providing better welfare. Is this correct, do you think?
Well, straw in itself is deemed to be an optimal type of enrichment unless it's provided in a rack or in briquettes. If it's provided as bedding, it is usually considered to be optimal. And one of the definitions that is used of an optimal type of enrichment is that you don't need to provide another type of enrichment as well as, because it already covers those 4 characteristics that are considered to be ideal. However, if you wanted to go on, and I have seen systems where people have had sort of straw bedding and they've also provided some Hessian sacks as well, that's only to the good, you know, for trying to do the most for your pigs. But I wouldn't say it's necessary. If you're providing straw, then you're already providing an optimal type of enrichment.
Yeah, just apologies there. There's there's 2 parts to that question. And there's a reference to struggling to find any scientific context to do this in reference to straw and multiple use of enrichment. And do you know of any research that suggests that these measures offer significant improvement to welfare? And is it likely to be incorporated into the code or red tractor at any time?
There is a number of papers that suggest that enrichment or certain types of enrichment do offer a range of pigs' welfare benefits. Those have been published in scientifically peer-reviewed, and they're the basis for these inclusions and that actual legislation that states that pigs should have permanent access to enrichment types. So there is some, if you were to have a little look on Google Scholar, for quite a significant body of information regarding welfare benefits for pigs of enrichment.
Thank you. There's just a reference to the root vegetable being put in feed. If it was put into the feed, would this be? It would probably be classed more of a feed than an enrichment. I would think that would stand to be correct on that. Would you agree?
Probably. I think it just depends on the chunks, and obviously if you're providing it quite chopped up, it's going to disappear quite quickly. So you're providing something that actually they're only going to use for a very short period of time. And I think you know, we know that pigs sort of like the novelty wears off of any of these things quite quickly, but the idea is really to try to provide it for a more sustained period of time.
Okay, and final question, just closing the webinar. Can you just, there'll be hopefully there's potentially a lot of third-party breeder owner units on the line listening to the webinar. Could you just re-go over the point in regards to the evidence they need from their supplier or who they sell their pigs to as a 7-kilo outlet?
Yeah, it says in the code that if you're a breeding unit and you're an owner or manager, you will need to start requesting evidence from the units that you supply, evidence that they have a tail biting problem in order to justify the docking that you carry out. So this was, I understand, largely to try to prevent breeding units saying we're going to dock all the tails because we don't know what units they're going to go to, or vice versa, the units that take those pigs saying, well, it's not my problem that they're docked, that's how they came to me. So it's trying to close that loop on the legislation and say we don't have any guidance on what that evidence needs to be. It doesn't state that within the code. It just says that the owner, it is their responsibility of a breeding unit in order to ask for evidence to prove the necessity for them to tail dock on the breeding unit. And we're waiting clarification to find out what would be acceptable evidence.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. There's no further questions have come through, so I will leave. I'll just say thank you again to Claire, and thank you again to Aisha behind the scenes. A little bit of apologies for my little bit at the beginning. Is technical issue, so my slides wouldn't turn at the beginning, but no problem with that. We are going to have some more webinars in the future, so please look out for our information either on the website, on the Pork Weekly, on the Twitter, on the Facebook pages for information of more webinars in the future weeks and months. Thank you very much, everybody, and hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you.